Okay, let's get started. Now we are discuss about the Poetics by Aristotle. Section 4, Critical Issues, Chapter 24. Solution to critical objection, essential and unnecessary. As regard problems and their solution, one may see the number and nature of the assumptions from which they arise by viewing the matter in the following way. The poet, being an imitator just like the painter or other maker of likeness, he must necessarily, in all instances, represent things in one or three aspects, either as they were or are as they are said or thought to be or to have been or as they ought to be. All this he does in language with an admixture, it may be of strange words and metaphors, as also of the various modified form of words. Since the use of these inconsist in poetry, it's to be remembered too that there isn't the same kind of correctness in poetry as in politics or indeed any other art. There is, however, within the limits of poetry itself a possibility of two kinds of error, the one directly, the other accidentally accepted with the art. If the poet meant to describe the things correctly and failed, though lack of power of expression, his art itself is at fault. But if it was through his having meant to describe it in some incorrect ways, that the technical error or impossibilities of whatever kind they may be have got into his descriptions. His error in that case isn't in the essential of the poetic art. These, therefore, must be the premises of the solution to the criticism involved in the problems. First, the matter relating to the poet's arts itself. Any impossibilities there may be in his description of things or faults, but from other point of view they are justifiable if they serve the ends. Objection of critics and how to offer define against these. This chapter is also quite technical, like the chapter on diction. Here, Aristotle is looking at creative work from the point of view of the critic or reader. He analyzes possible critical problems and the objection that critic could put forward against a work of art. He also put forth answers for each critical issue. Hampton Frey called the chapter one of critical casualty. The age of Greek creativity literatures was followed by the age of critics, who furnished like gains in the climate of Alexandria. These critics tended to make a literal examination of poetic statement. Aristotle analyzed the criticism to which poetry is labeled and suggests the line one which each issues may be solved and each objections answers. A poet is an imitator like any other artist. There are three ways in which he can represent objects. He can represent them as they were or are, as they are said or thought to be, or to have been, and as they ought to be. The imitations is done through the medium of words, which include strange words, metaphors, modified form of words, and so on. Further, before criticizing poetic work, it should be remembered that correctness in a poetry is different from that is political. From instant within poetry there is possibility for two types of error: one come out of wrong technique, the other out of not knowing correctly the object being described, a factual error. On the basis of these premises, Aristotle goes on to deal with critical problems, charts of possibilities, impossibilities. Impossibilities should be in general avoided that they are something justified. They are justified if they support the end of imitations or the purpose of art itself. The scene of the pursuit of Hector's by Achilles in Homer's Iliad is justified even though impossible because it serves the purpose of art. Represented in drama, it would be ludicrous and hence unjustifiable. But in epic, it becomes justified because it hides the effort of the effect of grandeur. There are some accident impossibilities. These arises from the poet imperfect knowledge of certain fact. Aristotle gives the example of the presenting a deer without the honor of poetry itself. If they make the effect of some position of the work more striking, the pursuit of Hector is an instance in point. If, however, the poetic end might have been a well or better attained without sacrifices of technique, correctness in such matter, the impossibility is not to be justified, since the description should be, if it can, entirely free from error. One may ask to whether the error is in a matter directly or only in accidentally connected to the poetic art, since it is a lesser error in an artist not to know, for instance, that the hint has no order, then to produce an unrecognizable picture of one. Further, if the poet descriptions be criticized as not to fact, one may urge perhaps that the object ought to be as described. An answer like that of Sophocles, who said that he drew men as they ought to be, and Euripides as they are. If the descriptions, however, be neither nor of the thing as it ought to be, the answer must be then that it is in accordance with opinion. The tales about gods, for instance, may be as wrong as Xenophobia thinks, neither true nor the better thing to say, but they are certain in accordance with opinions of other statements. In poetry, one may perhaps say that they are better than the truth, but that the fact was so at the time. The descriptions of the arm, their spheres stood upright, but in the ground, for that was the usual way of fixing them then, as it is still with the Lyriania. As for the question whether sometimes said or done in a poem is morally right or not, in dealing with that one should consider not only the intrinsic quality of the actual word or deed, but also the person who says or does it, the person to whom he say or does it, the time, the mean, and the motives or the agent, whatever he does it to attain a greater good or to avoid a greater evil. Other criticisms one must meet by considering the language of the poet by the assumption of the rare or unfamiliar word is a passage or a word or metaphor used in an unusual sense or punctuation. This is impossible according to the fact of zoology, but does not violate poetic truth. This drawback can be excused. Mistakes arising from ignorance of some special field of knowledge can be justified if at the same time it does not violate poetic truth. The impossibility can also be justified if it arises from the poet's wish to represent a character as he ought to be rather than as he is. This is what Sophocles does, and it is justifiable because the poet is represent the idea here. Here one remembers what Aristotle says regarding the tragic character. It is the poetic end to which is most important. Charge of irrationality. Once again, poetic truth serves to answer the charge of irrationality. The false is often believed by man. Accepted belief and opinions may be factually false. Homer's representations of the gods as immoral may be true or false in the ordinary sense of these terms, but they are in the accordance with the acceptance, belief, and opinion. In this case, the poet isn't representing things as they are, or to be nor as they are, but as they are accepted or are thought to be. If the thing as represented by the poet seems irrational, there could be another reason for this. It might have been so at the time the poet wrote of, and hence true. Many things may seem irrational in one age, but may have been the most common thing or practiced in earlier time. Aristotle, as usual, cites an example, the statement that the sphere stood upright button upon the ground may sound irrational as it seemed ridiculous manner of the standing and spheres, but the practice was common a long time before it was historical true and hence justifiable. Charge of moral incorrectness. There may be a questions raised whether what a person does or say in poem is morally correct or not. To this, the answer is that we must examine any dubious word or act and see whether it is justifiable in the context. It isn't only the word that should be considered in isolation, but it should be considered in its context. Who say it and to whom and the motive of the persons in say it. It is of the importance of consider if the deed or word in question arose out of an intentions to achieve a greater good or to avoid a greater evil. This is a very well point raised by Aristotle's molarity should be considered in the light of its context and not in isolation. Speaking generally, one has to justify the impossible by reference to the requirement of poetry or of the higher reality of the preferables of opinions. For the purpose of poetry, conceiving possibilities is favorable to an unconceivable possibility. And if men such as Zeus depictions be impossible, the answer is that it is better they should be like that as the artist or to improve on his model. The improbables one has to justify either by showing it to be in accordance with opinions or by urging that sometimes the irrational does not violate probability, for there is probability of things happening contrary to probability. The contradictions found in the poet's language one should first test as one does an opponent's confutations in our dialectical arguments so as to see whether he means the same things in the same relation and in the same cause before admitting that he has contradicted either sometime he has said himself or what a man or sound sense assume as true, but there is no possible apology for improbability of plot or deprivative of characters when they are not necessary and no show is made of them, like the improbability in the appearance of egues in media and the absence of the helons in Orestes. Okay, do like, shares, and subscribe. Thank you.